Welcome back to English AO2, Critical Writing About Literature. You know me by now. My name is Nicole, and I am the instructor of this course. This asynchronous lecture covers course material for Week 9. The title of this lecture is Revise and Revise Again. In this lecture, I will return to the topic of revision. Not by telling you the magic recipe for how to revise your argumentative research paper, although by now I have given you some ideas, but rather by considering how we typically receive, give, and implement constructive feedback about our writing. First, I will examine the position of the student as the one who receives feedback from a peer, mentor, TA, or course instructor. What kind of mindset does a university student most often cultivate when receiving feedback? How can students equip themselves to receive feedback in a more receptive way in order to produce the best possible results for the revision process? Second, I will talk about how to give feedback, as this will be part of your role in the upcoming peer review assignment. How can you give feedback in a clear, compassionate, and generative way? Finally, I will offer some suggestions for best practices when implementing and responding to feedback. Believe it or not, implementing feedback is not always about responding to each and every point in an instructor's feedback. Listen to this section carefully, though, as I am not advising you to ignore important suggestions for the sake of convenience or due to a lack of understanding. I will suggest ways of deciphering the most crucial and urgent elements of feedback to address first. Goal setting is an important part of the writing process, and so some elements of feedback can be addressed in the long term, beyond the context of a single course. In this first section, I will address some of the assumptions that we have about receiving feedback, as well as the ways we might understand the student's relationship to a peer, mentor, or course instructor giving feedback. I want to invite you to take 3 full minutes to free write based on the prompt. Pause the video and consider, how does it feel to receive feedback from others on your performance? What comes up for you? As you read over your reflection, I will speak about my own experience as a student, a TA, and now as a new course instructor. I am both a dedicated teacher and a learner, and I emphasize to my students that I am constantly learning from them, learning from myself, and from emerging scenarios, and therefore recalibrating. But in doing so, I sometimes feel vulnerable to the feedback I receive, as though it calls into doubt my expertise in that space. And this is completely normal. I try to remind myself that feedback should apply to teaching practices, just as I provide feedback to my students. In either case, as the giver of feedback and as the receiver of feedback, this process should never be a measurement of who we are, whether we belong in that space, or even what we are capable of doing. Feedback is simply a response to the work that we have produced in that particular moment and context. What other kinds of assumptions do students typically have about giving and receiving feedback from others? First of all, and perhaps the most common but also the most subtle, when you receive feedback about your work, remember that the feedback is not a measurement of who you are as a person, but rather an assessment of the work you have produced within the conditions you were able to produce it. The assessment is also of the work as it currently exists in the moment it was submitted or shared with the reader. It is not a measurement of what could be. Remember, too, that the person providing feedback doesn't know about the conditions in which you wrote the submission. Perhaps you ran out of time. Perhaps you spent a long time on the assignment but got lost in the weeds, or didn't fully understand the assignment instructions. And hey, that happens a lot. No professor is completely innocent of writing the occasional confusing assignment description, of not providing enough information about the assignment, or even confusing the students by contradicting what the assignment description says. Not all readers of your work will have the same set of experiences as you, and so they may take for granted that what they perceive to be a simple error or a source of confusion is actually something that you have continued to struggle with. Students, TAs, and course instructors have different learning styles, as well as different styles of communication. Some TAs and course instructors write very little commentary. Others write everything that they can so that the student has no doubt of what could be improved. I would identify in the latter category. I don't fill your assignments with feedback to show everything that went wrong, but rather I provide an abundance of feedback to show with transparency my reading experience of your work. I will get to this later, but remember that whether the feedback is a lot or a little, you don't have to fix everything overnight. Other assumptions. Well, in the case of minimal feedback or unclear, confusing feedback, some students will assume that the person did not actually read the work. Remember that confusing feedback can also stem from confusing writing. Hey, it happens. Sometimes we have to own it and recognize that the person giving the feedback is doing their very best to share their knowledge and expertise with the writer. This last point takes me to the next slide. Power dynamics. While I just alluded to the importance of being compassionate towards readers who try to engage with your works in progress, I also recognize that receiving feedback rarely involves equal power relations. Even peer-to-peer feedback is slightly imbalanced in terms of the power dynamics. The student reading the work takes on the role of assessing the writing and has the power to communicate positive or negative information about the piece of writing. Of course, most of us by now are familiar with the compliment sandwich. Teachers are advised never to give what could be perceived as negative feedback, better termed constructive feedback, without beginning with some praise. But that relationship entails some vulnerability. Receiving feedback is not just an emotional experience, though. When a TA or course instructor reads a student's work, it is also likely in order to assign a grade. Grades are a part of the power dynamic. As much as a course instructor can advise students not to be concerned about the grades or to let the concern with grades overpower other considerations, in practice, it is difficult to overlook the fact that grades can impact future success. That being said, we can cultivate a particular mindset as students in order to make the experience of receiving feedback and grades a crucial element of our learning, not just a passive experience of being assessed as a part of this power structure. Building on the power dynamics of writing, feedback, and revision, remember that we are all adult learners, and even adult learners can have fears. The 4 fears listed on the slide come from Thomas Sappington's article, Creating Learning Environments Conducive to Change: The Role of Fear, Safety in the Adult Learning Process in Innovative Higher Education. While it is not necessarily the job of a peer reader, a TA, or a course instructor to anticipate these emotional components of receiving feedback, we can address outcome fears and evaluation fears. I do this in my own role as the instructor, and as students, I think many of you preempt your concerns about your writing and how to implement feedback as quickly as possible in order to address outcome and evaluation fears. We can also think about how to address some interpersonal fears in the classroom in order to make the course and the learning space feel safe and conducive to learning. We can begin to address each fear by asking ourselves, what do I currently do to anticipate these fears and to allay them? Can I do more? Before I get to some strategies about how we might approach our mindset as writers and as students more generally, I wanted to mention a phenomenon affecting a large portion of students and people in general: imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is, according to Gail Corkingdale in the Harvard Business Review, quote, a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. Imposters suffer from chronic self-doubt and a sense of intellectual fraudulence that override any feelings of success or external proof of their competence, end quote. Now, you might think that this definition does not apply to you because you are in the midst of your undergraduate studies. Perhaps you have just begun university, and so success feels far off or relatively minor at the moment. But that is precisely why I would argue, as other teachers, researchers, and students do, that many undergraduate students struggle with imposter syndrome. In the University of Toronto magazine, Graham F. Scott offers this definition of imposter syndrome as it applies to undergraduate students. Quote, it describes a common trait among high-achieving people, a belief that their successes are flukes and that they will one day be unmasked as the frauds they feel themselves to be, that they are, in short, imposters, end quote. As Scott also notes, U of T is known for attracting some of the smartest, most ambitious achievers in the world. Research conducted at the University of Toronto in 2018, so relatively recently, suggests that imposter syndrome is widespread but has been rarely discussed here. Having conducted a 2018 study of U of T students through the University Student Life Center, PhD candidate Nick Feinig describes what imposter syndrome looks like for us at the University of Toronto. Quote, when students are struggling with their grades or do poorly on a test, they always feel like their failure is unique and everybody else at this institution is some kind of superstar. I teach a lot of courses and that's just not the case, but there's a sense that you're a unique failure, end quote. Yes, everyone experiences feelings of inadequacy at some stage. Anytime we are stretching ourselves, people may experience a feeling, a thought like, maybe I'm not good enough. That feeling can be healthy sometimes, highlighting areas where we truly need to hone our skills. However, it is when this feeling becomes chronic self-doubt that it becomes paralyzing. The writing process is one such place where self-doubt can be paralyzing and lead to writer's block. I have experienced that paralysis in my own writing. After too many rounds of feedback and constructive criticism from the same professor, I have convinced myself many times that perhaps my writing is just uniquely bad, and that some university representative will come knocking on my office door one day with a clipboard, ready to escort me off campus for crimes against academic writing standards. But as soon as I start talking to other students working at the same level as I am, I start to recognize that my experiences are normal. If I resist having these conversations, though, the paralysis persists. As Leanne Pico, a leadership coach at U of T's Oisey School, explains in the same article by Scott, quote, people allow imposter syndrome to stop them from stretching themselves. That can manifest as more serious mental health issues, end quote. So, how do we combat this feeling? Sharing your situation with peers who can sympathize, commiserate, and reassure as needed. That is precisely why I share my own experiences with all of you. The experience of being an undergraduate student is fresh in my mind as a PhD candidate, and I know that it helps to hear others describe similar difficulties, to challenge that narrative that we all perpetuate about ourselves as unique failures. Other strategies for building confidence? Activities outside of the classroom, which I recognize can be limited at the moment because of the pandemic. But there are extracurriculars that you can explore in the online environment. I mentioned that I play Dungeons and Dragons on Zoom every 2 weeks. I also took a Spanish class online once a week throughout the summer. I especially liked taking classes at Toronto's Spanish Center because the classes are not graded, so participation is very low stakes and solely for my own benefit as a learner. I also take live stream bar classes at least 5 times a week. Experiencing different kinds of success outside of the classroom can help us to put things into perspective and it tends to solve the problem of isolation as well. Another crucial consideration when we talk about giving, receiving, and responding to feedback is mindset. The terms fixed and growth mindset come from psychologist Carol Dweck, who works as a researcher at Stanford University. According to Dweck, there are two types of mindsets, a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, a person believes that their natural qualities are fixed and therefore cannot change. The person understands their intelligence and talents as innate, rather than something developed and improved over time. They also believe that talent alone leads to success and that effort is not required. While this definition makes fixed mindsets sound quite negative, it is worth noting that many of us experience a fixed mindset in one or more areas of our lives. In a growth mindset, a person cultivates the belief that their learning and intelligence can grow over time with experience. Learning becomes a process, distinguishable from intelligence as a fixed state. When people believe that they can become smarter, they realize that their effort has a direct impact on their success. When we think about the role of feedback, or even the role of failure, that is, getting answers wrong on a quiz or not achieving 90 or 100% on a writing assignment, these experiences can directly shape how effort is put towards achievement. I recall a couple of years ago speaking with a practitioner who coaches on mindset and emotional intelligence, and he explained his approach to raising his children. Rather than tell his children that they were naturally good at a particular skill set, he focused on the things that they could learn and develop. If one of his kids got all of the answers right on the math test, he would ask them, "But what then did you learn from this experience?" Learning doesn't really happen, or at least not actively, when answering all of the math problems correctly. Rather, learning is accomplished by working through those problems and getting some of them wrong the first time around. Again, the stakes are high in university courses. We all want to get the answers right the first time. We want our transcripts to reflect our capabilities. But I suspect that the process of achieving the final grades listed on a transcript can be more manageable if we reframe our approach to receiving feedback along the way. One way to reframe the process of receiving feedback is to be mindful of what Carol Dweck calls false growth mindset. Dweck later updated her distinction between fixed and growth mindsets by referring to a false growth mindset. That is, the tendency that some learners have to still fall back on that comfortable sense that some things just come naturally. In other words, yes, we can read feedback and see some areas we need to improve upon, but what we are really looking for are confirmations that we are doing great and don't really need to change all that much to succeed. It is a lot easier to believe this and to pick our battles in terms of what we choose to work the hardest at. But students, by their very nature, must be willing to receive feedback and improve their work. What might happen if, upon reading this feedback, students were to resist simply assimilating the comments and suggestions from teachers, mentors, and peers into what they already know about themselves? In other words, look for the comments that are most surprising and new, and consider the opportunity presented by thinking about your writing, your capabilities, in a completely different way. Feedback should not be used simply as a confirmation of what we already know we are good at, but in fact prompt an exploration of what we might not know about ourselves, about new concepts or even familiar ones. As I mentioned, feedback is also based on unique perceptions of what makes writing good, engaging, accessible, and clear. My knowledge, skills, and expertise will differ slightly from another instructor. It will also differ from your own perceptions of your work, the book you read, or the world around you. So, my feedback is meant to show you what you may not already be seeing about the course content or what you have produced in response to the content. Finally, remember too that what we might perceive as negative comments will differ, but can also be useful. Constructive criticism does not necessarily mean that you have failed at something, big or small, only that there is more learning potential to explore. Okay, that's enough about mindset. On to giving feedback and implementing it into your writing. In this section, I will identify some concrete strategies for how you, as the one reading another student's work, can approach feedback in a constructive, compassionate, and clear way. What may or may not have occurred to you is how you deliver feedback to others. Perhaps you have tried to tiptoe around a certain point in order to avoid beginning with an overly negative statement. But there is much more that we can do when communicating feedback to others. Many of your TAs and course instructors have likely tried to phrase their feedback in a way that avoids referring to you specifically. Instead, educators are advised to refer to the student's work, to a specific idea, in order to ensure that the feedback is not construed as personal criticism, equating the student with the essay. Ineffective feedback is often based on you statements. For instance, we want to avoid telling another student, your explanation was good or bad, or that you should use better examples. Instead, offer statements like, the explanation in your paper was engaging, or I needed more examples throughout the body paragraphs to better understand the argument. Take ownership of what you need as a reader so that the feedback is not entirely focused on the writer's shortcomings. You can offer subjective statements, but ensure that subjective feedback is not evaluative. Instead of good or bad, describe specific elements of the writing that can be improved. When giving feedback, remember to make realistic and concrete suggestions, rather than idealistic or abstract claims. A statement like, you should learn to use better examples, is neither helpful nor specific enough. Instead, it can be demoralizing. Feedback should be motivating and informative, without being demanding and a demonstration of your own knowledge. For example, you might write, I would have liked to see you provide a different kind of example. I am wondering if an analogy would have worked here. Finally, have you ever thought about giving advice as something that requires consent? This idea hadn't always occurred to me, but I have learned over time, especially in conversation with others, that we must be careful about moving too quickly to offering unsolicited advice. It is important to recognize that when giving feedback, not all writers necessarily need advice on how to fix the problem you have found. Start by identifying the problem you noticed, frame it using an I statement rather than a you statement, and then ask the writer how they might address the issue. While Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication model, or NVC, has been typically applied to other fields like social work, leadership, and interpersonal relationships, it can also be applied to how we give and receive feedback. NVC aims to shift the focus of how we communicate our experiences and emotions. It advocates radical self-responsibility through a simple yet effective framework for expressing what we are thinking and understanding, and how we connect with others with clarity and compassion. Rather than judging, blaming, or criticizing using NVC, we can start on neutral common ground. Typically, NVC moves through 4 steps. First, you make an observation. Second, you express a feeling. Third, you address a need or value. And fourth, you make a request. You might use NVC to communicate with your mother about missing her birthday. I recognize that you are frustrated that I missed your birthday. I'm feeling some frustration too. I needed to get my assignments submitted on time since school is very important to me and has been very overwhelming lately. What can I do to make it up to you? Would you be willing to let me make you dinner this weekend? NVC is very simple and helpful for interpersonal communication, yes. But it can, I would argue, also be adapted to feedback on assignments. First, make an observation. Second, express the confusion or source of misunderstanding. Third, address the need or value as the reader. And fourth, make a request or ask a reflective question. For example, I recognize that the thesis statement is trying to draw a connection between haunting and dementia, but I don't understand the reference to imagery. I need a bit more specificity. Could the introduction offer another sentence explaining this role of imagery before the thesis? So, as I have now mentioned, constructive feedback is based on I statements. I-style feedback is not only more specific because it is based on an individual reader's experiences, but it also promotes dialogue and even resistance. An example of an I-style comment that promotes dialogue and resistance is, I thought that officious meant bossy, but you used it as a political term. What does it mean in this context? A follow-up question could also be, has this particular use of the term been clarified for your reader? Notice here how the person giving the feedback identifies the source of confusion, asks practical questions about what the reader needs, and even invites the writer to defend their particular decisions in terms of the use of particular terminology. This is one way to provide clear, actionable, and compassionate feedback that does not reinforce the uneven power dynamic between the reader and the writer. In this last section, I will discuss ways of interpreting and responding to feedback that you may receive from a peer, TA, or course instructor. Different learning styles. I have alluded to this consideration before. Any given student may have a different learning style. Some students understand written feedback, while others benefit from a visual representation using a rubric. Some students read each and every comment left on their graded assignment, while others will contact me to talk about the comments and ask for further clarification. On the slide is just one visual representation of the overlapping learning styles. This graphic may not factor in other ways that you best process information. Other representations include the social element of learning, as well as logical and mathematical forms of learning. My main point here is to consider how you learn best and incorporate these elements into how you process feedback. If you know that you are an auditory learner, consider booking regular appointments with me, your course instructor, to process feedback leading up to the deadline of the final argumentative research paper. If you are a kinesthetic learner, perhaps print out the written feedback in the form of a checklist or cut up the body paragraphs of your paper to reorganize the structure of your writing according to the feedback received on a recent draft. Some other considerations for how to interpret feedback. First, speaking of vulnerability, give yourself time and emotional space to read the feedback. It is so important not to read feedback immediately before class. I tend to wait until some time has passed before I read feedback from students or from my thesis supervisor. If you read feedback just before you go to class, it might make you feel even more vulnerable or reactive to immediately interact with that same professor or TA. Likewise, upon reading feedback, don't immediately open up Microsoft Outlook and craft an email. Wait 24 hours. I think almost all of you have been really good about this so far in the course. When it comes time to actually read the feedback, divide up the issues raised into actionable and non-actionable items. So what can be changed or addressed by the end of the term? And what can be addressed in a future course? Personally, I always want to fix everything as soon as possible to feel that instant gratification in making things better. But there are actionable items that serve you in the moment for instance in the next class or in a subsequent assignment, and actionable items that can come later, serving you in future courses and in your professional life more generally. As mentioned before, divide up the comments for yourself into positive and negative feedback. Summarize the feedback for yourself and begin to craft a narrative of what went well and what you can improve upon. Try to acknowledge if the person giving the feedback has identified valid shortcomings or successes that you can recognize. This is a mindset tip, but is there something that you can be grateful for in the feedback? Is there a specific question you never considered before? Can you save this question for future writing projects? Ask for clarification whenever you need to understand a comment that is confusing but perhaps important to the outcome. Remember that this can be a dialogue if you feel comfortable doing so. Finally, it may be worth acknowledging what you cannot change, at least not yet. The format of this week's workshop is as follows. We will start with our usual community builder for 10 minutes. Then we will move into a review of iStyle feedback as a large group, followed by a revision workshop. Specifically, I ask that you come prepared with any one of the following: your introductory paragraph, a thesis statement, topic sentences, a close reading, or a sample body paragraph. Bring a specific element of your draft argumentative research paper that you want to improve upon and are willing to share with your classmate in real time. In return, each student will be expected to practice iStyle feedback. Please note that this week's workshop and next week's workshop will be especially important to attend, as they will give you an opportunity to revise your own work. If you have not had a chance to attend workshop much in the past, please prioritize the next 2 weeks. If you have any questions about the format of this week's workshop, please email me directly or post on the course Q&A discussion board. See you all soon!